Okay. Hello, thanks for joining. This session is actually going to be focused on unlocking the essential elements of private cloud strategies. Joining me in this session is Jevin Jensen. He's a research vice president within IDC. Keith Tudge, who is the data center manager for the NHS Foundation Trust, the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital Systems, one of our treasured customers. Scott McDermott, a technical marketing engineer. And my name is Rick Walsworth. I'm the director of product marketing within the VCF division here at Broadcom. And so thank you for joining. This is actually going to be a very interesting interactive session. And what I'd like to do as part of this is really take a close look at some of the key trends that are shaping modern cloud infrastructure. And when you think about modern cloud infrastructure, obviously the first place that people go to are the hyperscalers, right? In terms of what the folks like Amazon and Azure and Google have done to be able to build out these hyperscale infrastructures. But there's another dimension to this that we're going to essentially unpack as part of this, because one of the things we are seeing is that some of these workloads are actually being repatriated off of those public cloud infrastructures, from a native cloud standpoint and being brought back on premises. And what are the private cloud infrastructure or strategies that are required to do this? So we'll take a look at some of those business and technical benefits behind that. And then actually Keith will come on and tell their story about where they started and how within the Chelsea and Westminster hospital systems out of the NHS Trust out of the UK, how they've actually modernized their infrastructure and some of the results they've seen as part of it. And one of the big drivers behind this, one of the big themes that we'll talk about through the session is around automation and the ability to be able to have autonomous infrastructure as you're building out these private cloud platforms. And then look at how do you accelerate, you take all of these things together, how do you accelerate innovation? How do you bring application modernization? How do you bring AI into your infrastructure without essentially having to build yet another silo? And so that's the agenda we'll walk through here. At the end of this, we will be, answering questions live. But I do encourage you, if you do have questions throughout this session, please do use the Q&A session on this, and we'll be answering questions throughout the presentation. But then also we'll save questions for the end to be able to answer those live. Okay, let's get started. What I'd like to do now is hand it over to Jevin Jensen. Again, he's a research vice president for intelligent cloud within IDC, and he's going to actually walk us through the resurgence of private cloud and how that actually delivers business value and lowers the total cost of operations. Jevin, I'll let you get started.
Thanks, Rick. As Rick mentioned, I'm research vice president of IDC, and I cover what we call the intelligent cloud. The intelligent cloud is anything to manage, monitor, automate, or optimize your public or private cloud. And I may not sound quite like the normal analyst that you've heard or read about if you've read papers or had other webinars. And only part of that is due to my Georgia accent. So I think Rick speaks Southern, so he can translate if you have any questions about that as we go. But the real reason is I spent 20 years before joining IDC in the same seats, the same responsibilities as many of you on this webinar today. We had mergers, we had acquisitions, we had global teams, migrations, upgrades, maintenance, all those challenges. And so I try and bring that to these webinars. How did we address them? And then combine that with the research and data from IDC to hopefully come up with some best practices and something you can actually use in your day-to-day operations. So we're starting with this slide right here. This is the IDC's vision. And we don't expect any vendor to have all of these components today, or certainly not an enterprise to have implemented all of them yet. It's an aspirational view, 3 to 4 years down the road, but you can start working on this today. We came up with this about 4 years ago, updated it last year. And it's a vision of a self-driving infrastructure, just like the self-driving cars that you read about and are starting to gain traction around the United States and other places. It's proactive as far as workload placement. It's proactive as far as resilience and performance issues, being able to automatically handle these without so much human intervention. Now, AI has gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of years. Our vision here actually goes back, like I said, 3 or 4 years ago, and it was, AI and ML under the covers, finding these anomalies, filtering out the noise so you can take action or even have the automation take action for you. And some of the reasons for that is, of course, to power the digital enterprise, but also people are having trouble hiring. They have skill shortages. They have work gaps that they can't hire these people. And so we don't want automation to remove jobs from people. Maybe that was the case 10 or 15 years ago, but now we're trying to improve the work-life balance, make them more productive, not wake them up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and provide better business benefit. So if you go to the next slide, we'll actually get into some of the data. So we did a survey. This was just last quarter, so very new information. Where are these workloads that we want to manage and we want to make better? We want to make more automation available for those. And we found that it's pretty much in complete equilibrium. Even though the cloud has been out for 12 or 13 years, we had the rush to the cloud during the pandemic. It's almost 50-50 split here between production workloads on-premise, about 51% and 49% in the public cloud. Now, we break out Edge separately. That's obviously a company-owned location where you're putting those workloads. That's one of the fastest growing areas. It's smaller, obviously, compared to the private or the public cloud, but it's on-premise, and it's one of the fastest growing areas that you really need to address through your maintenance and your automation and your management solutions there. So we've got this equilibrium, and we also looked at the number of public cloud providers, and these are global 2000, so they're not necessarily just large companies. They're small and medium-sized companies as well that were all rolled up into this, and up to 3 providers that's the median public cloud provider. So there's only 4 or 5 hyperscalers, depending on how you define it, who you include in that list. So I don't know if it was by accident or acquisition, or maybe it was a strategy, but you guys have all 3 basically hyperscalers in your environment plus the private cloud. So that really adds a lot of complexity, and hopefully we have some ideas and some suggestions on how you can reduce that complexity and manage the rest of it. If you go to the next slide.
Yeah, just quick question. So how do you see this trending going forward? You know, it's pretty evenly balanced today. Is there any trend lines that you could point to in terms of where this might be heading in the future?
Well, it's interesting because in that same survey, I didn't include the data here, but I also said, okay, where do you think these exact workloads will be in 2 years?
Right.
And it was amazing that it was within 1 or 2 points of exactly the same scenario. So when I say equilibrium, I wasn't just exaggerating like we just got there. Even 2 years from now, we still show between 49 and 50% of the workloads will be on premise. So that was actually pretty surprising. Like I said, there were some anomalies, like you said, with the pandemic and things like that, these one-time events. But now we're in equilibrium, and it's not a dramatic increase from now till 2 years from now even. And nobody really can predict 3 or 4 years down the road, so we don't typically ask things much beyond that.
Right, exactly. Excellent, appreciate that.
So this is one of the reasons why you don't see that continual migration. Obviously, we started at 0 maybe 13 or 14 years ago with the public cloud just becoming popular back then. But the reason we don't see a tremendous growth in that area going forward is because people are telling us they're evaluating repatriation, as you mentioned at the opening. So 81% of companies are saying they want to repatriate some percentage of their compute, and even higher those storage resources. They're tired of the unpredictable costs. They're tired of troubleshooting performance issues, and they just want to bring some of these workloads back on premise. So that was also pretty surprising that if you're thinking about it, you're not alone. It's the vast majority of companies are considering bringing back some or multiple workloads.
Yeah, this is real interesting. And how about compliance and privacy? I mean, that's always been one of the larger challenges where, you know, you're going into a shared public cloud infrastructure. How much does compliance, security, and privacy come into play when looking at repatriation?
Well, you're a good straight man. If you want to go to that next slide, we double clicked into that and said, okay, what are the reasons why you're considering this? And what will be the drivers for the workloads that you pick to repatriate? And so we divided kind of evenly. It's very even, which we always like to see that. There needs to be business reasons for doing something. Even though we're in IT, we like technology. There needs to be a business reason, but there's some valid technical reasons too. So you can see, as you kind of mentioned, security is right up there. Security has been a problem for 20 years. I guess it'll be a problem for the next 20 years on top of that. The business is always concerned about that, and privacy, especially in Europe, that's a big concern, but California and other parts of the U.S., data privacy is a big concern for companies, and that goes hand in hand with security. But of course, cost is also makes the top 5 on the business side. The predictable nature, the return on investment, cost is a big nature. But then on the technical side, you see also they really liked their tools that they have on premise. They were mature. They were easy to use. They were well trained. They had a lot of people that could use those, as opposed to just one person learning this cloud, then somebody else learns the other tool on the other cloud. That gets really siloed. So these tools that are on premise, they felt like they had really good performance. Also on premise, they could predict it. They weren't sharing workloads. They weren't having to troubleshoot those performances. They knew what their hardware, whether it be networking or storage or compute, could handle, and they could allocate their workloads accordingly.
Excellent.
So another study that IDC did was called Business Value. So this is a very detailed study. We actually interview real customers. We don't take any numbers from the vendors. We talk to real customers. We say, how much are you spending in a wide variety of areas? And these customers span different industries. They're different size companies, not all large, not all small companies, a good mixture. And we look at their costs, both public and private cloud. And then we also divide that up, because you have different number of staff. So we divide it by staff, by virtual servers, by workloads, where they are. And we came up with, over 3 years, you can actually save 42% by using it on the private cloud. Of course, we saw on the screen before just that cost was one of the top 5 issues why people were looking at repatriation. And we validated that in this case study. And you can see all of our assumptions. You can drill into a lot more data than just this kind of high level number in the white paper. At the end of the webinar, you'll be able to download that and look at it for yourself, plug in your own numbers and figures based on how we calculate it, and see where your individual company may land.
Yeah, so we see a lot of that. Obviously, there is certainly interest in trying to get better control of cost, because that's what, the complaints that we typically hear in talking with clients that have, essentially moved workloads into the public cloud, is that, it might be inexpensive to start, but every time you're doing a get or a put into those public cloud operations, they're actually seeing those cloud costs increase. And it's really more the predictability and control of those costs that start to become an issue, because of the fact that if indeed I have an application that, let's say, is a little more chatty than the other applications, maybe hasn't been completely optimized for operating in the cloud, those are the ones that tend to take up more of that bandwidth and cost more, just because of the fact that they are essentially interacting in and out with that cloud operations more, and those costs start to go up as part of it.
Yeah, and that's what enterprises told us. It's not just the first year cost, or maybe the cost of capital to get into it. It's the 3-year spread out all the costs, both human and IT and software subscriptions, the whole 9 yards. But then it's the predictability. They want lower costs, but they also like predictability. Okay, I can sell this to my management as long as I'm right, and I don't have to go back and resell it the next year, which is when you start getting into hot water with the CFOs for sure.
Exactly. Great. No, I appreciate that insight, Jevin, because I think that plays really, really well into what we're seeing as part of this. And when you had your circle diagram in the beginning, I think a lot of the key outcomes that customers are looking for around agility and developer ready infrastructure, and the ability to be able to have infrastructure that's secure and resilient, but also compliant and cost efficient, really plays into that. And a lot of what we see is really trying to understand where customers are in their journey, because we realize that they may have deployed, let's say, vSphere, but they're still using traditional 3-tier infrastructure behind it. And so they're really trying to figure out, okay, how do I get to that next stage? So, we do understand that customers are on different paths and really trying to get to different endpoints as part of it. One of the things that we're really trying to do is trying to help meet customers where they are in terms of that. And part of that is really understanding, kind of how they built out their infrastructure to date, right? So if you look at it from, even those customers that have deployed vSphere at scale, where they've taken and essentially built their compute infrastructure, within a hypervisor, and they're getting all of the efficiency, all of the cost, all of the capabilities in terms of data mobility with that in that infrastructure. The challenge that they have is that, behind that, they're still using hardware-based solutions, right? They still have your traditional storage arrays and my 3-tier networking where I've got my tier 0, tier 1, and then underlying networking infrastructure. And then the security guys try to bolt on top of that. And so what it ends up seeing, and we certainly saw this through the IDC business value study, is that those customers that were using 3-tier infrastructure on-prem as their primary solution for delivering quote unquote cloud, they actually saw a lot higher cost associated with that. And they weren't able to break down those silos. So they really didn't have good cohesion between the storage teams and the networking teams and bringing that together from a security standpoint. And so what it did is it lowers the efficiency because I don't have access to modern infrastructure and APIs that I can use to be able to essentially automate a lot of those tasks so that the maintenance, essentially just keeping the lights on for that infrastructure, they end up spending a lot more around just trying to maintain and keep that infrastructure running as part of it. And so, as part of that, what a lot of companies did is they saw cloud as the easy button, right? They just said, look, I'm just going to lift and shift all my applications over to the cloud. And as we've talked about already, and as we'll explore, throughout the rest of the session, there are a number of challenges as you do that, right? That privacy does absolutely become an issue just because of the fact that I don't have complete control in terms of making sure that my environment is compliant with these infrastructure solutions. So privacy becomes a big concern. And then even if you are able to re-platform and refactor your applications to work there, which is a very time-consuming process, you no longer have compatibility between the applications that you have on-prem and the applications that are out there. And many organizations that have migrated applications in their cloud maybe have not optimized those applications. And as I mentioned before, those applications tend to be the ones that are more chatty, using more gets and puts. So they really haven't optimized the infrastructure to run on native cloud platforms. And so as a result, you are actually seeing those costs go up because of the fact that you don't have full control of those costs as part of it. But I'll tell you, if you look at that infrastructure and you look at the architecture behind that infrastructure, the one thing that cloud providers nailed and that they got right was the architecture, right? They essentially built a software-defined infrastructure layer that leverages standardized commodity x86 hardware. So they're able to take advantage of all the cost reductions that have taken place within that x86 server architecture and put all of the value in software. So it is a fully software-defined infrastructure. And rather than creating silos where compute and storage and network just don't talk to each other, this is a fully integrated solution. And that's the one thing that the hyperscalers really got well, is they made that infrastructure sing together in terms of getting the compute, storage, and networking teams on the same page and essentially delivering a platform that gives you that capability. Then on top of that, take that infrastructure layer and now build an orchestration layer that essentially automates a lot of the capabilities that Jevin talked about in the intro that you're looking for to give you that agility. So I can essentially use declarative syntax and I can use APIs as a way to power that infrastructure to be mated into a set of applications that I can now deliver through an IaaS consumption layer. That infrastructure as a service consumption layer, actually, that provides now the basis for being able to deploy these solutions at scale. This is exactly how the hyperscalers scale. They actually take this infrastructure and then consider these as building blocks that you can customize based on the applications that are deployed. So we take all of those same capabilities and all the benefits that you get from public cloud, as well as all of the capabilities and benefits that I get within my on-prem infrastructure. And we've actually built that together. And that's really what VMware Cloud Foundation is. VMware Cloud Foundation is VMware's primary flagship private cloud platform that takes that same architecture in terms of building a infrastructure layer with an orchestration layer that provides automation and operations, and then delivers it as a service to users that can consume that infrastructure. So it's that same model, But the difference here is that we actually provide the ability to be able to deploy that on premises. So I can take that on-prem, but I can also deploy this out across any of our supported public cloud providers, as well as all of our CSPs, our cloud service providers, so that it's extensible on-prem as well as within a cloud infrastructure. And some specific points out of the business value study that Jevin mentioned in the introduction came right out of that study. So there were 10 customers that were interviewed as part of this. Those 10 customers essentially were put together in building an aggregate model, a composite model that actually showed over 500%, 564% 3-year return on investment. So in other words, if I invest in that platform, I'm getting this return within a 3-year payback or within a 3-year period and a 10-month payback on that investment. Now, show me where else you can get that sort of payback as you're deploying these solutions at scale. And some of the things that factored in to that ROI and that payback were lower infrastructure costs. So I think this points to the point that Jevin mentioned earlier. 61% faster in the ability to be able to deploy new workloads. So that's really where the agility comes in, where if I can automate tasks that might have been manual tasks in the early days, if I can automate those tasks, I can now deploy those workloads 61% faster, 66% faster in terms of the ability to essentially identify and resolve data loss incidents. So again, that's less downtime, less impact to your customer environment, and the ability to be able to take and essentially move these entitlements from on-prem to any of our supported cloud providers through license portability. So that gives you not only the investment protection, but also allows you the ability to take those entitlements and now run those out across distance. And so I think the best way to be able to describe this is actually let one of our customers tell their story. So I'm going to open it up now to Keith Tudge who's a data center manager from Chelsea and Westminster Hospital System out of the NHS Foundation Trust within the UK. And Keith, I'll let you tell your story.
Hi, good to meet everyone. So I'll take you back to 2021 and just sort of give you a bit of a background of where we were as a healthcare trust back then. So back then in 2021, we had 4 separate VMware environments across 3 geographic locations. We were running obsolete hypervisors. You can see there we had vSphere 5.5 back in 2021 still. And we had underlying this, we had obsolete hypervisors and obsolete hardware. And we knew back then we had to take a real step forward in modernizing our data center. So the next step for us was in 2022 when we took VMware Cloud Foundation 4.2. So straight off the bat, one of the challenges for us was migrating all those workloads from the 4 VMware environments into VCF. So we used VMware's HCX and created that network, and that was really good for it. It was a really seamless migration of those 700 VMs into VCF. And then off that point there of VCF, then at 4.2, straight away, we were in a much better position from day one. We had site resiliency, so we went for a stretch cluster with dual site mirroring. So that gave us like a real belts and braces DR position. We had the lifecycle management within VCF and the centralized sort of identity management. So on sort of day one of taking VCF, we were in a really good point. But when I've talked about this, I always say for us, our VCF was a journey, and it didn't stop and start on day one. And that's sort of, if Rick takes us on to the next slide then of how we've progressed our VCF journey. So we've had several milestones along the way. And I guess like a lot of companies, we have small IT teams and we don't necessarily have the bandwidth to take VCF on and utilize all of its components on day one. There is an element of learning and getting to grips with it. So we sort of broke our journey down over a period of years. So 2022, we took 4.2, and that was our first sort of implementation. 6 months later, we did our first big upgrade, which was a big step for us. We were understanding what the product does, and that upgrade journey for us was like really, really seamless. I was really impressed with that. When we first did the upgrade, I was a bit sort of cautious about how it was going to go. And sort of Broadcom at the time offered us 2 options: a rolling 24-hour upgrade or doing it 9 till 5. We initially went for the 24-hour upgrade just to see how things go. I probably wouldn't do that now because I ended up staying awake for a long time with a paranoidly watching the upgrade, but it was absolutely seamless. It got to a stage where actually I didn't really need to be sort of staying up and watching it. It was working perfectly. So in April 2023, we took some of the new VCF features, so malware detection and prevention, and the behavioral IDS and IPS. And this immediately was another great big step for us. So within the NHS, we've done a lot of work around our north-south security, but east-west has always tend to have been neglected. And straight away, bring in the IDS and the malware detection. That really helped secure our east-west traffic, and we started experimenting with microsegmentation. Back in April 2023, we still had Server 2008, all those vulnerabilities. So the microsegmentation features in NSX really helped to sort of put a bubble around those legacy operating systems and create a secure infrastructure for us. Our next step was, again, 6 months later, we took to the next big upgrade to vCloud Foundation 5. Again, it's another seamless upgrade for us. And at that stage, we introduced NSX Advanced Load Balancer. So up until this point, we had various different load balancers, Kemp, F5, and other vendors all dotted around from these legacy IT infrastructures. And NSX LB really helped to sort of migrate a lot of our load balancing workloads into a really easy to use interface. And it integrates really, really well with NSX and sort of creating that seamless sort of migration of workloads from our Kemp and sort of alternative vendor load balancers into NSX. And November 2023 was another point for us where we started our first foray into virtual desktop infrastructure. Initially, we'd sort of begun looking at creating it as a separate standalone environment, and then after speaking to the Broadcom guys, we sort of realized actually we could just add this in as an additional workload domain in VCF now, whereas where we had our normal compute server workload in a management domain, bringing in VDI was just seamlessly plugging it in, connecting it up to our NSX environment, and made that implementation so much easier. Then if we spin forward another 6 months, takes us to June 2024. That's when we took VCF 5.1, and our big landmark at this point was our first introduction of an AI workload. So we've been working with a couple of our clinical partners in the private sector. And one of these ones is around doing a work around chest x-rays and sort of using AI to sort of not necessarily predict when the person's outcome from the chest x-ray, but it's more to give the doctor and the clinician more information on how they can sort of then feed that back to the patient. And for us, that AI workload, it's partly, we're at the moment in a hybrid environment where part of it's based in the cloud provider, and a big part of it is on-premise in our VCF environment. That for us is a limitation of our hardware at the moment. We have a hardware refresh due next year where we're going to hope to look to bring in some AI workloads and GPUs to really cement that big in-house. And then October this year, just gone, we upgraded to vCloud Foundation 5.2, which may seem from 5.1 to 5.2 a minor change, but I'll tell you, 5.2 has been such an absolute game changer for us. It's perhaps not one of VCF's sexiest features when we talk about patching, but for me, with a cybersecurity hat on, the live patching in VCF has been phenomenal in 5.2. I'm sure you're all aware there was the recent vulnerability that for vCenter that came out in October. In the past, we've had to use the async tool that Broadcom provides to patch the various components of VCF. And it was a really good tool, but it was command line. It did take a little bit of experience and know how to use it. With 5.2, the patching's all done in VCF SCDC Manager, and I can't praise it enough. I don't want to sound like I'm doing a sales pitch for Broadcom, but the live patching in VCF 5.2 was brilliant. The vCenter patch was pretty much next finish. Went off, did the snapshot, upgraded vCenter, and it was done. And it was done within an hour. And for us in the NHS, where we need to patch these systems quickly when the patches come out, that was such a big improvement for us. And I think it's probably I say to people, if you're anywhere on the VCF journey, get to 5.2 as soon as you can, because that live patching is such a big step. You want to take the next slide then, Rick?
Yeah, absolutely.
So within the organization, we've sort of looked back over the last 2.5 years of what VCF has given us. And it was quite interesting when we only started this look back of how it's impacted us a couple of years into the journey. But we'd already, within our team, anecdotally, sort of realized the environment was much more stable. And for us, that was with our IT teams. We just weren't being called out of hours. When we had that back in 2021, the sort of obsolete hypervisors and obsolete hardware around, the number of call outs we'd get out of hours for failures was huge. And then we've sort of worked back through our service desk manager over the last 3 years, and we've seen, and we can sort of like demonstrate the drop in P1 and P1.2 calls we've had from taking VCF. It's been phenomenal, and that all goes down to a more stable environment. And for us, the stable environment's important for giving clinicians confidence in the IT environments. When we had the obsolete environments, one of the big feedbacks we used to get from clinicians was there's a lack of confidence in IT, and some of that becomes, by extension, lack of confidence in sort of the IT team's ability, because when clinicians see the IT platform fall over, they sort of almost quite rightly ask, what are IT doing? And of course, bringing in a more stable platform just helps the clinicians have confidence that the platforms will be there when they need them. And that's always been a big thing they said for us. I mean, within the NHS, we spend an awful lot of time planning our DR processes and downtime processes, and they're really well embedded in the NHS to deal without IT. But it's been really good getting some feedback for the clinicians about how infrequent that's had to happen. It's the outages we've had now have been application level, not infrastructure level, and that for us within IT has been a huge step for us. VCF, we've been doing a lot of work now migrating off these legacy Windows operating systems, working with our clinical partners, and VCF's helped us seamlessly move those workloads around, and faster deployment of new workloads. And as I touched on with the live patching, the patching within VCF has improved so much, and it really helps address the cyber vulnerabilities that inevitably going to come out and always will do. So that's been like some really big steps around the reliability for us at VCF.
Yeah, outstanding. And Keith, I can't let you go without kind of sharing the story that to me was the cherry on the icing on the cake, so to speak, in terms of just the ability to not only bring more stability into the systems, but then also resilience against failures that may be outside of your control.
Yeah, so yeah, to touch on that, the way we work with our dual site mirroring is we treat both sites as active, and we run virtual machines from both geographical locations. But for periods of time, we like to move all our workloads to one of the two sites, just to stress test links, and to prove it works. And I can say it's a funny story now, but at the time we'd moved all our workloads to one of our remote data centers just to sort of like stress test, because that goes over a public MPLS link, and we just wanted to stress test all the workloads. And I'd moved over there on the Friday night, so everything was running out of all 600 VMs were running out of one data center. And I just then happened on the Sunday evening to log into work to do a little bit of maintenance work on some other systems, and noticed all the VMs were now back in the original data center on our on-premise sites at hospital. And I thought, that's odd. I'm sure I moved those workloads. And I was on-call manager at the time. I hadn't got called out, and I sort of spoke to my manager. I said, well, I've gone through the logs and we've had a complete site failover, but no one's called us. And we sort of had a quick chat with our network team, and we established we'd had a complete network stack failure at a hardware level in our data center. And all virtual machines had restarted in the other data center. But for us, with a 24-hour healthcare environment, it was initially, bearing in mind where we'd come from with these obsolete hypervisor environments and this downtime, it was initially baffling that no one had noticed. We thought, like, surely someone's noticed. Then we sort of dug into it, and we noticed all 600 VMs restarted within 6 minutes. we won't sort of like stir the pot and sort of ask questions. And we followed up the next day, and we just sort of casually and sort of quietly in the background said, "Do you have any IT problems last night?" And the most feedback was, oh, there was a network blip around about 8 o'clock, but everything came back and we carried on. So to all intents and purposes, we'd had a complete site failover due to a network hardware stack. But VCF works so seamlessly with moving those workloads and restarting them all up that the users ultimately didn't notice. And for us, as IT teams, that was amazing for us.
Yeah, no, that's a great story because typically a lot of people wait for the phones to start ringing to know that something went wrong, but the phones never rang. So that's a great story. I really appreciate you sharing that, Keith. And again, I couldn't imagine what would have happened back in 2021 if that same outage would have taken place. So it just shows you kind of the resilience of the platform, and not only that, but how I think you have built a solid foundation, leveraging some of the capabilities such as stretch mirroring to be able to provide resilience against those sorts of failures.
Yeah, and let's say if it had happened back in 2021, the hospital would have been on the point of shutting down and having to divert patients to partner hospitals. Appointments would have been cancelled. The impact would have been disastrous, and that would have taken. That's always been the thing we've had from our clinicians and healthcare teams, is we've got well-drilled DR plans to work without IT. But once the systems are back up, they need to start inputting data again, and it all takes longer to recover. And I think for me that was such a big thing. I was still paranoid that evening that my phone's going to ring in a minute. Surely someone's noticed, but it was absolutely seamless for us. It's incredible.
That's a great story. Great story. Well, again, appreciate you, Keith, and don't mind if you stick around. We may have some questions that come in on the Q&A. Just as a reminder, please do ask questions within the Q&A bar, and be happy to answer questions as we go through it. So we're going to shift gears here because couple of the concepts that we've talked about here I think are very important, and I think one of the most important ones is around automation, because when you look back to some of the business value statements that we made earlier and some of the capabilities that are enabled, a lot of this is enabled through automation, right? Taking what might be a manual step and trying to automate this, as part of that overall platform. And so essentially within this architecture diagram, which we've talked about before, where I've got this compute layer, that's essentially mated and integrated very tightly with the rest of the infrastructure in terms of storage and networking as part of that. But it's all tightly coupled, right? So I have the ability to deliver an automation and operations layer that can now provide the ability to be able to manage everything from capacity and configurations and tenancy, so that now as I go to operate these systems, I can operate at scale and really just focus on anomalies rather than having to manage the plumbing. So things like, site reliability engineering and fleet management, security management really now become part of the operational model. And then now as you go from kind of that, persona around cloud infrastructure, cloud architect into the consumer, now the consumer has an interface that allows them to be able to automate at scale. So when I'm talking about managing this and operating this, now the consumer, which are typically the platform teams or the DevOps teams, they now have the ability to be able to do this at scale as well. And so if you look at the outcomes that are typically built as part of this, I look at this as really kind of 6 key steps to building, deploying, and operating a private cloud, where I set the cloud up, I deliver infrastructure as code, so I can use declarative syntax as a way to be able to essentially dictate what I want these systems to do. I can automate delivery of infrastructure as a service, leveraging a self-service catalog as part of this. Then I go to operating it. I can deploy and manage net new workloads. I plan and optimize my capacity, and then I troubleshoot and remediate across there. And the best way to demonstrate all of this is really through a demonstration. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Scott McDermott. And Scott, I'm going to let you kind of walk us through the demonstration and show us how VCF automation works.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for the introduction there, Rick. So yeah, starting off with our VCF IaaS components already configured here, we're just going to take a quick look at how the standard VCF user would look at and consume that self-service catalog that's been built out for them by the cloud administrator. So in this example, we have our VCF user logged in here, and they're part of the corporate users project. And so the cloud administrator has shared a number of extensibility actions and automation templates with the corporate users project. And so that really allows the organization to leverage existing infrastructure and standard practices that they maybe already scripted with the extensibility actions, while also consuming and creating automation templates in Assembler here. So let's dig into the shopping cart application here. And so we can see there's a custom form here with some additional information to help guide the users, along with these info signposts that will give the user additional information about the field to fill in. We're supporting, standard string value fields along with encrypted password fields and drop downs. And so these are going to be defined in the cloud template and defined with a standard YAML syntax. So it's quite simple to get up to speed on. And so we can take a look at this drop down. We've specifically set these 4 options to be enumerated and available to the user to select. But we can also offer additional functionality post-deployment, like getting a Slack notification or ensuring, in this case, our shopping cart application is available on the public cloud network, or also enabling OS monitoring by installing a Telegraph agent. So let's go ahead and just quickly select each one of those. And now let's also take a look at what this may cost to deploy. So with operations, we can take a look at the daily price estimate. And in this deployment, we have 3 machines: a load generation machine, a front-end web server, and a database server. And you may notice that the compute price is slightly different for each one of those. And that's because they each have a different number of CPUs assigned to them. And take a look at that in a moment once we get this deployment kicked off here. So with that, let's go ahead and submit this deployment. And one of the great things in Service Broker is the policies and governance. And so here we've triggered an approval policy. And so the VCF Cloud admin would get a notice, an email, and they would be able to approve that. And so once they approve it, since we selected that Slack notification, we'll go ahead and get our custom notification scripted to us. In this example, we have our web URL that was created as part of that shopping cart deployment. So if we click that, it quickly shows us the end user, our application's been successfully deployed. So let's jump back to our deployment. So here's what the deployment looks like. Now that it's been deployed, we've expanded it here, and you can see each one of those machines, their power status, the network that they're attached to, along with their IPs. And additionally, we get that month-to-date pricing. So even though it's only been deployed for 20 hours, we've started calculating and reporting that. And so on our deployment, we can click over here on the right-hand side and take a look at the day 2 actions that are available for the entire deployment. So that's going to include the virtual machines, the network. So if we edit or delete or power off, that will take effect to all of those machines. So we can quickly just kind of scroll through here and see those actions. But if we want to take actions on specific resources, we can click into the deployment. And here we have this front-end machine selected. And so if we were to click actions on the right-hand side here, we could see the day 2 actions that are pertinent to the Cloud vSphere machine here, like adding a disk, connecting to the remote console, making a snapshot. And these are really helpful for the end user because it frees up IT from doing these tasks manually. Maybe you have a ticketing system, someone needs a snapshot done, your VI admin has to go in and do that manually. This way, it's a much more self-service action for the user. They don't have to wait on IT. IT doesn't have to do these sort of tasks. And so looking into how operations integrates with automation here, we can click this monitor tab and begin to see the performance of the machines and their CPU, their memory, their IOPS, and their network throughput for each of those machines. And so with operations monitoring these machines, it's observed that some of the machines are oversized, some are undersized. And we can see the allocated CPU 1, 2, and 4, and that's why we had the difference in pricing as well, because we're charging based on the CPU allocation. And so you can select all the machines, click right size, and that'll take the actions in vCenter to align the machine with the recommendations coming from operations. And then next, we want to take a look at our pricing details. And since it's just been up for a day, let's switch to daily and take a look at these details. And so in here, you can see specifically the breakdowns for each one of your machines or resources that are being consumed to see what they're actually going to be costing you month to date. And so that's kind of my quick run through as what an automation user would experience. And so let me go ahead and stop sharing, and I'll pass it back to you there, Rick.
I appreciate that, and great demo. I think it was an excellent walkthrough. And you know what's interesting, as you point out some of the cost scenarios there, Scott, is that, you know, again, considering that it's an IT organization that's essentially offering these services to internal groups, if I wanted to set up chargebacks, I can leverage that cost modeling that you had within there as a way to be able to essentially provide chargebacks back to the organization, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Awesome. No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Great. So we're going to shift gears here to the last segment of our presentation, and really going to take a look at innovation and AI and kind of what's the impact of this on private cloud strategies. And one of the challenges that we've heard is that, you know, customers have essentially built out this infrastructure and they've taken all of their kind of legacy applications and all their core infrastructure applications and basically running it on this private cloud. But when it comes to things like AI, the first conversation is, let's stand up another silo to be able to support AI as part of it. And so one of the things we want to look at is that what are some of the strategies that companies are deploying as part of this. And so I'd like to ask Jevin back in just to be able to walk through some of the things that you're seeing from IDC standpoint in terms of how is innovation impacting decisions around infrastructure.
Exactly. When you're thinking about new applications or even refactoring or modernizing existing applications, one of the most common use cases, and we've really seen exponential growth just the last couple, 2 years, 3 years, is in containers. And so we went out and asked, you know, for this year, what is your budget? What is your planned investment in containers? Because you can run containers on bare metal, you can run them in virtual, you can run them as a cloud service. There's multiple different ways to run containers. So how are people investing in that? And we found out really, you know, they want this hybrid mode, like we saw earlier, with the workloads pretty evenly in equilibrium between public and private. That was the number one answer. They wanted a hybrid cloud, a more comprehensive platform, but the one that could run and span both public and private. And then closely followed by that, number two was actually they want to just have it strictly on-premise, an on-premise only container. Now, I added the red stars over there because in 4 out of the 6, you know, possible solutions for deploying containers and those containerized, you know, future applications, the ones with stars, those can be primarily or solely on-premise. So lots of, again, focus. We talk about repatriation, containers. A lot of people think of the cloud first, but really that's very popular for on-premise, as you can see for the first 2 answers and 4 of the top 6 answers.
Yeah. So how does this play into cloud operations as you look at that, Jevin?
Well, we have so many enterprises that call us, and you know, day 0 and day 1, that's very important to be able to automate and do provisioning and deployment quickly in an automated fashion. But really, day 2 is where you make your money or lose it, unfortunately, in some cases. So you need that resilience. Even just slow performing can cause a customer to leave and go to a competitor. So we encourage a focus on day 2. We've got the current status. A lot of people have been talking about AI ops, but we want to move that to more predictive, that proactive nature that I spoke about earlier. And that's combining also the IT automation, which has been around for a long time, with observability. Those are probably going to be 2 separate products. We don't foresee those coming together, but they can be tightly coupled, and that creates what we call smart automation. Event-driven, I'll talk about in just a minute. That's a key capability that we want enterprises to look for in their current products, or if they're shopping, looking for that for a future capability that they can implement. Getting down to the cost, we want to optimize. You just saw Scott, he showed where you could actually see your cost before you deploy. That is a very mature and a great capability, because everybody's got those surprise billings from the cloud providers and the CFO calls. Nobody likes those. So we want to see you move not just from a tool that you run once a month or once a quarter, but a full mature FinOps process. They call it crawl, walk, run in the FinOps Foundation. We want to see you move towards that higher level of maturity. And so it's an ongoing, and even before you deploy, kind of conversation and discussion, because those savings are basically unlimited if you can save it before you go live. And then SaaS, a lot of people think of infrastructure as a service. They want to optimize that, but SaaS, people often spend more than that than they do on all their cloud providers combined. So you need to find your SaaS providers and then optimize those. You don't have to wait to the end of the contract and do it once every 2 or 3 years.
Got it.
So if we double click on the next slide, we'll go into some new capabilities. Again, we're trying to look into the future a little bit here, but you're starting to see these capabilities delivered. Gen AI, of course, that's gotten all the rage. But that can really help your operations, whether it's doing a report or a dashboard generated with Gen AI for your infrastructure, looking at your environment, or even infrastructure as code, being able to use Gen AI to create that infrastructure as code. So maybe the people that aren't true developers can still write infrastructure as code on your operations teams. Event-driven, I touched on that just a second ago. That is a proactive nature, where you see something in the environment happen, you know what the repeatable solution is. It's been tested, it's safe, and you don't have to wake somebody up. You don't even have to wait for a ticket. The system can automatically apply this proven solution before you get a ticket, before the solution even goes down or the application goes down in a proactive manner. That's what we're looking for always. And then finally, policy as code. Like infrastructure as code, you can actually create policy, whether it's for your GRC, your government risk and compliance, to make sure you don't have that configuration drift. Or we talked about AI, you just mentioned that, Rick. If you want to deploy AI, people are afraid it'll run amok. You can put these guardrails up for either automation or your new AI-enabled applications, where they stay within the guardrails and keep you compliant, but also keep the application up and running, and so it doesn't take over and steal resources from other areas. So we really want you to watch for those two.
Yep.
And speaking of AI, that really came onto the scene, especially Gen AI 2 years ago. And so IDC went out and said, okay, how are these proof of concepts? What are actually enterprises doing, and how successful are they? And surprisingly, it was less than 80% ever made it out of proof of concept to production. And so we said, why are you struggling? What is the problem here? We touched on this earlier. It's the lack of developers, lack of skills, lack of people. That was number one, but it was pretty closely followed. You can see that by cost. We really weren't hitting, either the costs were too high or the ROI payback was way too low on this AI-enabled application. So those were the top two reasons for that. So IDC decided we need to help companies help address these problems. So we formed an AI council, and you can see just one of the outputs on the next screen here. We came up with this guidance. And so that kind of graphic there, of course, there's a lot to back that up, but if you go from left to right, that says you look at your business, you look at your data, you move through and find the business use cases and calculate that ROI, and then you can move into your sample use cases. So that's kind of a step-by-step guide as far as how you need to decide and go through the process of seeing where AI should be applied and, quite frankly, where it should not be utilized. And we came up with 200 sample use cases. Those are just kind of the high-level use cases in the areas, but underneath each one of those is 5 to 10 additional specific use cases where we think AI can have a low-hanging fruit, where you can get those early wins. You can have an ROI. We really want you to hold your teams accountable once they identify a use case and find out the ROI. Go back and audit it. Go back and hold them accountable for those ROIs. And don't worry about the fear of missing out. Just because your competitor is doing AI, does it really have a payback? I want my competitor doing all the AI projects that they can if they're losing money on every one of them. That's great. They're gonna suffer financially, and I can do nothing and make money and beat my competitor. But obviously, there's plenty of use cases that have great payback. But don't do one just because your competitors are, or because you read about it on an airplane magazine.
Yeah, and what I love about this, Jevin, is the fact that you've got data at the center of all of these decisions that are being made,
Yeah.
and the ability to, not just leverage the data, but you're, constantly kind of using this as your, foundational model in terms of what I make, decisions about for my business as I go forward. So I think this is a good foundational model for that.
Yeah, data is the key. We used to talk about master data management, getting your data clean, but now it's not just you have clean data. That's kind of like table stakes. Now you've got to train it. You've got to set up your inference engines. You've got to, make sure that you're not going outside of those guardrails that I mentioned earlier with pulling in data from a source that, maybe violates somebody's privacy or somebody's copyright. You got to get your legal teams involved. So a lot of steps to get involved before you just jump into it.
Perfect.
And my last slide here, just what we recommend. We talked about that day two success. That's combining automation with observability. We want to make those workloads flexible, like with containers, and make that decision early on. Where should this be with your FinOps teams, with your cloud architects? Should it be on private or public? Are we trying to optimize for cost or for performance or both? Keep all your options open because you have multiple clouds, you tell us, and you obviously are going to stay on-premise and private clouds for the time being. So that's the key to that autonomous operation and making those decisions up front so you can be successful on day two. The workforce, we don't see the demographics getting any better. Unfortunately, we're not even graduating more people with the skills from universities. So you need to invest in your people. We want to retain your people, but to do that, you need to give them the tools, the automation, that day two, event driven, so you don't have to wake them up, so we can retain them and also provide a better service and better business value, to be candid, to our end customers as well. And then finally, on the FinOps and the SaaS, you've got to optimize that. You've got to evaluate those workloads like you saw in the demo before you go live, because that's money you've never spent. So you don't even have to worry about trying to save it and claw it back and make changes to your environment. If you make those decisions up front in an organized manner and the tools enable you to predict those costs, you're going to be in a lot better situation.
Yeah, I love these recommendations. And the one that I constantly hear in conversations and briefings with, end customers is really around how are they up-leveling their workforce and the ability to be able to take somebody, let's say was a VI admin, working on vCenter and vSphere. Now they have the ability to go across that, not only work on storage and networking, which, obviously looks great on their resume, but then as you start bringing in AI and containers and Kubernetes into it, this is the ability to not only take those skill sets, but and up level those skill sets, but also allow them to be able to start to contribute now on things that are strategic to the business. So rather than keeping the lights on, as I mentioned earlier, it's the ability to be able to now take them and essentially have them be assets that you can leverage as part of your overall business strategy that helps them, but also helps the business as you're moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. The people processing technology, I always say people come first for a reason. That's where you need to invest before you invest in the other two areas, for sure.
Outstanding. Well, again, we're at the end of our time here, so I did want to just do a quick summary and a few key takeaways, as well as some of the assets that we talked about here, both in terms of the business value study. You can get that directly from this QR code. And then, Keith mentioned his experience with VCF 5.2. There's actually another white paper that it talks about some of the details that are available within VCF 5.2. So those are the two QR codes there. But just in terms of quick takeaways, just as we wrap up, I think the ability to automate, infrastructure really addresses a lot of challenges that customers look at facing in their cloud operations. As workloads start to go from public cloud onto private cloud, how do you build that out? How do you address some of those requirements and some of those challenges that Jevin had talked about before? And we think, private cloud is actually a strategic way to be able to do so. But automation and operations are really key aspects to any modern cloud deployment, regardless of whether it's deployed on-prem or out, at the edge or even in a public cloud infrastructure. And then certainly AI is a key driver for it. And one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that AI fits into every strategy, not as a bolt-on, but something that is essentially part of that digital transformation project as we go forward. So I want to again thank our speakers, Jevin, Keith, and Scott, for providing, I think, a lot of great data within this. I see no open questions, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude the webinar at this stage. Simon, thanks again for everything you've done to set this up. And thank you for everybody that attended this webinar. Look to see you on a future webinar as we go forward. Thank you very much.